Yes, the entire NBC star-making machinery is behind Frank Zappa. This January, he will be starring in his own situation comedy as a high school basketball coach on The Zappa Wonders. Tonight, to unveil NBC's new look, Frank Zappa. Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
Hello and welcome to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. We're Gary Seath and Brad Robinson.
And you're not.
This week, we're talking about the early years of SNL. Season 4, Episode 3, with host and musical guest Frank Zappa. This show originally aired on October 21st, 1978. Brad, how are your feelings on Frank Zappa?
I wasn't ready for this. I don't know.
Are they?
I don't know Zappa. I don't know Zappa well enough. It's a bummer. I'm not like a Zappa connoisseur, not really a Zappa fan. Don't dislike Zappa. Just don't know him well enough.
You definitely had thoughts coming into this episode on what this episode would be, right?
Well, I mean, it's notorious for being a train wreck. So, of course, we notoriously had to bring in Mr. Saturday Night, Andy Hoagland, back onto the podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. How are you both? Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, we thought this would be a good warm-up before we bring you back for season 16 for the Steven Seagal episode. So this would be a good kind of middle ground.
Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of developing a forte for the really offbeat, potentially disastrous episodes.
Oh, but in my opinion, last season you did the best episode of the season with us. So,
true.
Yeah.
And Jodie Foster was that was more like I appreciated the fact that Jodie got to host. But
well, I think we all agree that Louise Lasser episode was much better and interesting than we gave it credit for going into. I feel like we all learned a lot by the end of that discussion.
We learned about ourselves. We learned about the show. We learned about Mary Hartman.
And honestly, that was my hope for this show, was that the train wreck that we knew was coming would be an interesting train wreck that I learned something from. Unfortunately, I don't know that it actually, I don't have the same feelings as I did about Louise Lasser.
This is just a bad episode. I mean, that's all there is to it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we might have some daylight, Gary, but I guess that's the point of this episode. We'll get into it.
That's why you're here, Andy. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you guys you're living this world, right? You're breathing this world. For me, not going, episode by episode chronologically, I had a mild appreciation for this one. I don't think it quite lived up to its reputation as excruciating.
Right.
Dated, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the material does not work, but that's kind of par for the course when you're watching an episode from like 47 years in the past.
But Andy,
right? So I'm a little open-minded about this one.
But you've seen enough episodes. Are you telling me you watched this, you finished, and you weren't like, that was trash? Like, you actually thought it was okay?
Yeah.
Wow.
No, to be honest, I'm not, watching these like, Mystery Science Theater 3000. I feel like it's kind of what you guys are doing. Where it's like you're in there, you're watching, and you're trapped. I watch these for pleasure. I appreciate them for what they are. And then if I get bored, I turn them off and I return to modern SNL, which is just firing on all cylinders, as we all know.
Now I'm excited. I was actually kind of worried we were all going to come in and all have the same general idea. So I'm actually, I'm open-minded. I have renewed excitement to talk about this episode now.
Yeah. And look, I don't have any strong feelings that this is a classic. I have no illusions about that. I just, having been aware of the reputation, having watched it in preparation for chatting with you gentlemen, I was a little surprised to the extent that I was entertained.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Yeah, totally.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be from a train wreck perspective.
Right.
But also kind of, from an entertainment, from a comedic value standpoint, it wasn't where I want it to be either.
Sure.
Right. I mean, I was reminded that, when we watched Charles Grodin together, much of that episode is just classic SNL.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, where you think about like Steve Martin, Blues Brothers, like there's certain episodes that you're like, how is this live comedy and not preordained classic? This is not quite that. But at the same time, I wasn't, loading the handgun either. Is that an okay metaphor in 2025? I think it is, right?
Who are we to say? We're stuck watching stuff from 1978. Our metaphors are all screwed up.
Yeah, you guys are Tom Servo. Such a Tom Servo vibe on this episode.
But Gary, I can feel you judging me. You like
Brad,
Zappa? You know Zappa? I feel like you know Zappa better than me, at least.
I know Zappa better than you. Yes. I don't know that that's necessarily a high bar that I'm clearing, but I do know Zappa better than you. So we talked last week, Brad, about Fred Willard and how big was Fred Willard, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you're going to come at me with the same questions about Frank Zappa in 1978.
Maybe not as much as
Okay.
I was questioning Fred Willard, but I am curious, like, exactly how famous is Frank Zappa? How mainstream is Frank Zappa in 1978? Because I don't think he's released his biggest records yet. So I genuinely don't know, like, how cult he is versus how mainstream at this point.
Well, I think, Frank Zappa has been around for a while. He has been on Saturday Night Live once as a musical guest.
An
2
excellent
seasons
musical
ago.
guest.
Yes. Phenomenal.
Yeah, totally.
And right before this, I guess like 6 months before this show, the Live from New York album that he recorded when he was in New York and a musical guest last time had just come out. So he's, again, in the zeitgeist. He had some big albums after this in the 80s, but I think, earlier albums like Overnight Sensation happened in like 73. And the original incarnation of the Mothers of Invention were in the 60s.
Right.
Yeah, that's the 60s.
Right. So he'd been around.
This feels like a very SNL move. Underground SNL, the SNL that's part of this like cultural movement that's not fully mainstream yet. This is very on brand for them to have Frank Zappa do double duty.
Is it odd that they do it so quick after having the Rolling Stones do double duty? That just hit me too. Like, you literally just tried this trick 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that was surprising to me of you're having another musical guest as your host, 2 weeks after.
But SNL is comedy rock and roll at this point, right? So I think it's a very natural and logical decision to have these icons of 60s rock music come on and have like a very prominent role that transcends just being the mere musical guest, right? Like, this is SNL, the avatar for baby boomer culture, right?
And I guess to that point, it almost makes more sense to have them have Frank Zappa than the Rolling Stones, because the Rolling Stones is like the rock and roll of it all. But like Frank Zappa as an artist, like he's like a rock and roll satirist, no? Like, doesn't he do with his music what this show does with comedy? So it's almost like, in theory, this should have been a better fit than the Stones.
Yeah, but Frank Zappa comes into it. He does have a sense of humor, right? I don't know that you can say that about the Rolling Stones. Like you said, he has humor in his music. So he's coming at it.
He does, but does that humor line up with this show? I actually had that question at the end of the show in my notes. I said, does Frank Zappa have the right sense of humor for this show? Because he obviously has one with what he does with his music, but obviously these two worlds just are bumping heads the entire time.
I think he does have a very different sense of humor than the show in general. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I understand your point. Like, it's not connecting and clicking here necessarily like you would want it to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like SNL's on this trajectory where they're becoming more and more mainstream and universal, right? Like, maybe they're still a decade off, but Zappa's never quite that figure in music, right? Like, he's always like an underground, like,
right.
If you love Zappa, you love Zappa. And, maybe other people haven't even heard of him.
Right.
That's my impression.
Well, to that point, Zappa, and Gary, if I'm wrong, let me know. I'm sure you will. But like he always did his own thing because he was cult and underground. So he could always do whatever he wanted, however he wanted. And to Andy's point, NBC has the show and SNL is becoming more and more mainstream. They have to kind of play by the rules a bit more, even if they're their own rules that they've set up. So now you bring in Zappa, who by all accounts has a pretty big ego that clashes this whole week with the show. And you're trying to fit this, I do things my way, however I want, into this SNL construct.
It seems like he would have been a better host guest in season 2 when things were a little more free form and you had
That's true.
opportunity to do
Fair
things,
point.
right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
But that's what I find interesting about this is like you're starting to see the show become more and more formalized and establishment friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, well, no, we're still a show that has Frank Zappa do double duty.
Right.
I find that kind of a very unique aspect of this.
But then you fail miserably at it. That's I think what bothers me is yes, you're right. And then they bring him on and I just think they failed on almost every level on this episode.
All right. You guys are harsh on this one. I'm ready for this.
Okay.
Great.
Ooh.
Should we just get into it?
Let's do it.
Actually, I think that this is a nice segue into the cold open, actually, to this conversation is we start with Fred Silverman, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, John's first Fred Silverman impression.
So he comes on to camera to talk to the audience about all of the research that NBC has done, and all of the different research has pointed to what viewers want is Frank Zappa. And so NBC has signed Zappa to a deal starting with tonight's SNL.
And you're going to be NBCing a lot more of Frank Zappa.
I like that. I mean, this was how big broadcast TV and NBC was in American life at the time, right? Like Fred Silverman could anchor a cold open.
Brad, one of my only notes was Brad's in heaven. It's John to camera by himself.
It's no, I mean, it's fine. It's an okay cold open. It leans into the host. I kind of like this idea. I thought they were kind of setting up a little bit of a runner, or they're leaning into Zappa and being on the show. I kind of like that idea, getting a little bit, kind of meta, like Andy's saying. I mean, I don't think John killed it. I wasn't like, this is amazing, but he did a good job.
I do think it's, Belushi is sort of at the peak of his power a little bit, right? Like he's now the star of the show.
Mm-hmm.
So, having him come on as like a mere executive for a company like NBC just shows how big John has become in terms of the SNL stratosphere.
I think it's an interesting choice as a cold open, given the apparent issues that were prevalent the entire week going in, that you're still doing a cold open that's kind of all in on your host. You don't revert and do something else, and you stick with this kind of all our chips are in on Frank Zappa being, this NBC thing.
Why don't we talk about those issues? Because I don't know that people know what those issues were.
Well, I guess the big issue that you get is that this has gone down as one of the most infamously worst episodes in the history of the show, and that Frank Zappa was so bad he got banned from ever returning. And I think, as we'll talk, he's not good and doesn't do any favors for himself.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't like this episode, you can't hang it all on Frank Zappa. And apparently, I guess he came in, had a big ego, I guess, and was asking for things and wanted to do things, I think, a lot in his way. And so he was clashing with the cast.
Right.
We'll, I'm sure, talk about it more, but when we get to the Freak Mountain or Night on Freak Mountain sketch, this drug culture, which at this point, the show is so big and everybody is doing so many drugs on the show, versus Frank, who's this very anti-drug person. So you've got that. And so I just think it's they never clicked. Frank, he's done an interview where he said he found out after the show that after the first meeting they had with him this week, nobody wanted him to be on the show, but no one ever said anything to him about it. And you kind of see it through this episode. First of all, he's not in a lot. He's only in 2 sketches besides his musical numbers. He plays himself in both sketches. But whenever you hear about the badness of this episode, he's always reading cue cards and mugging for the camera. And they make it sound like he's in the whole episode tanking every single bit.
Right.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm kind of reacting to is it's just not accurate with the actual episode here. I mean, one thing...
I just think the sketches are just poor sketches, whether he's in them or not. I just don't think they're overall very good. But the big thing I should say that happened that caused really this is apparently the dress rehearsal went horrifically bad. Not in the way we saw it on TV, but just very bad. And so the way that Frank Zappa chose to deal with that was to then do what we saw in the opening monologue in a minute, and the blatantly reading of cards and mugging for camera. Don Novello has been quoted, and he said, just Frank Zappa didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to deal with a really bad dress rehearsal and then knowing you're going to go live in front of millions of people in a couple hours. And he said, without telling anybody, he does this thing. He says he turns into Dean Martin. and just starts reading cue cards and made it a point to be very obvious and kind of throwing everybody under the bus. And there's like that ego thing I think we're going to see happening where he's like, I don't agree with whatever you guys are doing, and I'm going to do my own thing, and I don't care what happens.
I mean, I kind of love that. I gotta say, like the idea of Zappa as a Dean Martin countercultural figure, I think is a really interesting choice.
It's an interesting way too that he decided to deal with that, right? Like his reaction is, I'm not an actor. I'm just not going to pretend like I'm an actor, and I'm going to blatantly read the cue cards. And when he comes out for his monologue next, he reminds us, like, just to remind you all, I'm reading from these cue cards under the camera.
Because he comes out, he's like, hiya, hiya.
Yeah.
Like he's like a Muppet. And then he starts talking about like NBC's new look, which continues the premise from the cold open, right?
Right.
So I like that.
And then he goes into singing Dancin' Fool with the band. A satirical song, Brad, like you were saying, commenting on disco. But I don't believe this song had actually been out yet.
So I guess at the time, too, he was in the middle of trying to leave Warner Brothers, his record label. So he actually did have a new album out like a month before, which he references in the Conehead sketch. But this doesn't come out, I think, till next year when he starts releasing his own albums on his own label. And it's that next 79, what's it called? It's a great album title. Is it Shake Your Booty? But it's spelled like chic, S-H-I-E-K, and your booty. It's a great album title. And it'll go on, I think that becomes his best-selling album of all time. But yeah, it'll be a single off of that album.
Who was the girl that he brings on stage? Like, was that an actual audience member?
I think it might have been, but in dress rehearsal, I believe it was Lorraine. In dress rehearsal, they did a bit where Connie Conehead comes up and he talks to Connie, which kind of plays into when we get into the next sketch. It kind of makes sense. I don't know why they took her out of it. Unless maybe there was something with that whole like from dress
That'd
to
be
here.
a nice runner then.
Yeah.
The
way he took a turn. I don't know. Because she's obviously already in wardrobe and cone and ready to go. But
because it makes sense that they meet. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know who that was, though, who they replaced her with.
It seemed like a genuine audience member because, she didn't know how to react or what to do.
Yeah, she did not. It's true.
Yeah.
You can't fake that.
But I'll agree with you, Andy. I enjoy this monologue. I didn't know the song, but it is a fun song. I didn't, again, because it's the first time we've seen him, I didn't mind his mugging and mucking up of the dialogue. It was like, okay, he's just like playing a joke. Like the joke kind of worked in the opening monologue. So I'm not like incensed that he did this off the bat. But
after the monologue, we immediately get a huge reaction from the audience for the Coneheads when we see Beldar come home. And then he's talking to Primat, and then Frank Zappa comes in and gets a huge reaction from the crowd. Huge reaction.
It made me wonder, I know we talked about this on the Rolling Stones, how much of that crowd that night are SNL fans versus Frank Zappa fans? Because he does get a huge response when he walks through that door.
Because it's like Zappa, a human alien meeting real aliens. It's like a perfect combination.
Oh, it makes so much sense. Yeah, exactly. Conehead, Zappa. And for Halloween, I thought this would have been somewhat of a Halloween sketch because of Coneheads and Zappa, but I agree. Yeah, it's like fitting Conehead, Zappa. I mean, he wrote a song called Conehead at this point in his career.
Right. It was fun. He comes to take Connie out on a date, and Beldar invites him to consume mass quantities with him, and he tries to keep up with Dan, and he cannot.
So, Zappa, where did you meet? Zappa.
Yeah.
Where did you meet our young one?
I spotted her in the front row last night, and I knew she was really special.
Naturally, as a parental unit, I am concerned with whom our young one interacts.
Look, Connie told me where you're coming from. I realize that as French people, you must be very wary of Americans. Don't worry. I used to have a French person in the band, and I know I can take good care of her.
Good.
Hi, Connie.
Hi, Frank.
I mean, to be fair, when he breaks, Dan's delivery is pretty classic. Like he's sitting there and he's got the beer like, so, Zappa.
Yeah, I have that down. Yeah.
It's a really good delivery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have in my notes here that this is the first moment, but he seems very distracted during this, and he's like laughing throughout it.
Well, this is where you first start to see it. Yeah. He comes in the door and he's like, "Hi, I'm Frank Zappa. I'm a musician." And he keeps not knowing what camera to look at. And he's like very blatantly kind of just throwing everybody off. And then again, when he sits down, he's kind of mimicking the Coneheads, which I thought I actually like him in this sketch. It's not bad. Him breaking, again, I thought Dan's line was so good. I could see how you might break.
Right.
This is what I'm going to say, though. Like, this whole episode, I think this is a bad episode. I can't blame Frank Zappa for it all.
I thought Dan and Jane were really good when they were talking about their, before when they were dating and stuff, when they were lecturing
I thought Jane
Lorraine.
was great.
Jane was
like,
excellent.
God damn, she is so good. And they start talking about flap rags. I thought that was funny when he talks. She was the only one except for those few flap rags, and she starts yelling at him. Can we take a moment, though, to bring up the fact that the premise of this sketch is that
yes,
Frank Zappa is supposed to be taking out their high school age daughter on a date, right?
Are you going to say
1978, baby?
Yeah, exactly.
But it was, I don't know, it was fun to see Coneheads with Zappa. I don't know if they got as much out of it as they could have. And, it's the first sketch, so you don't know where he's going as far as his vibe. And, to your points, Andy, my note at the very end of this sketch was, this episode is not horrible yet. I don't think this is a bad episode yet.
Well, the next sketch just said, "Hold my beer." Because
I was going to say, what was going on with this one?
Keyword in that my last sentence was yet.
Yeah. So this sketch is Bill and Lorraine and then Gilda. They're a family and they are housing prisoners. John's a prisoner under their staircase, kind of like Harry Potter. Garrett is in the coat closet and he's locked in there, but he helps Lorraine get her cardigan out and whatever. There was no setup for this. There was just like, you were thrown into this and you had to figure out for yourself what the hell was going on. And it was not clear. Like, it was very...
Yeah, it's like, were they trusting the audience too much or not enough? Like, it's a grim premise. It's not funny. I didn't understand the satire besides like, oh, this is a way that the government is paying people to cut down on their own infrastructure or their own prison resources, I guess. I'm not sure. Was there something in the news that justified this?
I don't know.
And it's about government cutting, right? Like it's like, oh, well,
I did at one point write down the same note. I said, was there some sort of like run your own prison program back in 1978? I never heard
Yeah,
about.
like you hear about public-private partnerships all the time these days. And I'm like, well, back then, maybe that was like, this is a way to, trim the fat and cut down on overhead for prisoners. I don't know, but it's kind of lofty for an idea for a sketch on a comedy show, and the laughs are very borderline. So I'm not sure they justified this. I'm not sure what inspired it. Maybe they should have done more or done less? ?
Yeah, I mean, you got pieces of it from what Bill was doing, right? Like, he's working on the books and trying to figure out how they can make more money for taking in prisoners, but why? We don't really know. And then it all wraps up where Dan is a prisoner up in their linen closet, a former arsonist who starts rioting, and Gilda goes out and then kicks him out and kicks all the prisoners out. And that's how you end the sketch, which, Brad, my only thought was, oh, Brad might like this because everyone's in it. I don't know.
It is one of my notes of trying to find something good that the whole cast was in it. I did appreciate that. All right, let's see. How do we unpack this one?
Why do we unpack this one?
Well, because I think there is more to it. And I didn't like this sketch at all either. I don't think it's very funny. But this was written by Brian McConchie. I never say his name right.
Was it really?
Yeah. So, and he's a new writer this season. And I think he was we haven't really talked about him yet because this is the first episode he's credited as a writer. But, he's like the show's attempt to replace O'Donoghue. Like, he's another Lampoon guy. He's got that kind of out there sensibility. He left Lampoon to come to the show. I think this is very indicative of what he likes to write. Like he has some other sketches we'll talk about in the future where he takes kind of like two opposite things or just things that don't make any sense together. And that's where the comedy is supposed to be. You know, if that's your thing, then you may think this is a great sketch. And it's like brilliant. Like it's so funny because it is. It's these two completely ridiculous things, a suburban house, a prison. They don't explain it, which I feel like the three of us, none of us liked that fact. But I feel like someone else would come in and argue, well, you don't dumb the audience down, explain it to them, you just throw them in this situation.
Well, yeah, that's the counter. It's like this is on purpose, right? Like they've just thrown us in.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
It's purposely on purpose.
Well, R.I.P. to Brian, though. I just want to note that he passed away earlier
this year. Yeah.
So if nothing else, I think it's worth a serious discussion of this episode for just honoring his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, he'd go on to write for SCTV and win an Emmy, I think, for writing for that show in the 80s.
Yeah, Shining Time Station.
Yeah, he's in Caddyshack. So
yeah.
he's definitely a guy who has been around comedy, knows comedy, knows his stuff. For me, and I think us personally, this particular sketch didn't land.
Absolutely.
But you can't blame Zappa for this one. Just to our point of like train wreck and Zappa's horrible, like everything we just like, you can't blame him for any of the bad things about this sketch.
And I don't think that's the only time we'll say that this weekend either. Well, that then takes us to Weekend Update, which felt really fast to me.
Yes.
She said it was at midnight. I don't know if it actually was. It was only like 20 minutes in, but we get Weekend Update brought to you by Missionary Positions, Inc.
I thought it was funny.
Yeah.
I like that joke.
Jane does a lot of jokes straight away. Betty Ford facelift, Firestone recall, where they'll turn them into condoms. And then Bill comes on and talks about the World Series, which the Yankees had just beaten the Dodgers in.
Oh, he did. That's right. I forgot about that joke because one of my questions at the end was, did Bill do anything other than Celebrity Corner? I forgot about the World Series.
He did this World Series joke, which I didn't really understand why it was so exaggerated, but I meant to go back and look at the box score. And then Bill brings back Celebrity Corner. And this week he's interviewing.
It got a good response last week.
Yes.
It did. It got a good response when he brought it up this week, too, from the crowd.
That's true. Yeah.
He interviews Sid Vicious and his mom, played by Brian Doyle Murray.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing.
And yeah, it was funny how much he looked like Bill when he was sitting there in that wig. And it was like, oh, yeah.
We should say he interviews his mom, played by Lorraine.
Right.
Brian does the same thing they did last week, where Brian, who wrote this piece, plays he plays the male counterpart to the interview who does not speak the entire time.
Right.
Instead, he just stares at his brother, envisioning a world where he becomes the update anchor. Almost like manifesting it.
Oh, my goodness. That's right. One day, I will have that chair.
So, yeah, he interviews Lorraine. Sid Vicious was about to go on trial for the murder at this point.
This just happened, right? Weeks ago? Like it was
weeks ago.
Yeah.
Do you guys think Brian Doyle captures Sid Vicious better than Gary Oldman? What's your gut reaction?
He's pretty creepy. And because he just sits there and stares, it's like...
He gave me more of a Gary Gilmore vibe, personally. But
I could see that. This was an interesting Celebrity Corner, but
it was. Did they finish it off with a Claudine Longet joke again?
Oh, I didn't catch that. At
the end, they were like, "What are you doing?" And Lorraine's like, "If all goes well, we're going to be on the Andy Williams Christmas special next month."
Right.
And Bill says something like, "If anybody knows, Andy knows what you're going through." And I was like, "Are they still making Claudine Longet jokes?"
I guess so. That's funny. And then after that, it goes back to Jane and then introduces Father Guido Sarducci, who comes on to talk about the election of the new Pope.
That's John Paul, right? John Paul II?
John Paul II, yes. And he goes on to show us the campaign buttons from all of the cardinals who wanted to be Pope. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
This is a great character. There's something like lovable is the wrong word, but there's just something so lovable about Father Guido Sarducci. It's like, yeah, it's silly, but I enjoy it.
I agree. I think he's so good as this character too.
I agree. The character is totally there. And you can tell, I mean, this is a character he had been doing for years before he was even on the show. And you can tell because he just comes in and everything's in place. I think he just needs a little bit of time in the audience because it's only the second time we've seen him. But he's a great person for update. Getting him off the stand-up we saw last season and putting him behind the update desk as like a correspondent is such a smart move. And I think the more we see him, the audience, well, we know the audience just fall in love with this character more and more.
Yeah, he's a defining update correspondent, right? Like he's got to be on the Mount Rushmore. I mean, I like the bit about, watching Grease and Olivia Newton-John should have been elected Pope.
I like the joke. They had the one about the two cardinals running together. It was a pretty good gag.
Oh, yeah. Every other day.
Every other day.
Every other Sunday. Yeah. That was good.
Not a bad start to his run on Update.
No. And immediately after that, it goes right to Dan. There's like no introduction or anything. Just camera cuts to Dan.
Yeah, just pops up.
Yeah, he's sitting in Bill's seat.
I know. He's sitting in Bill's seat. And he introduces point counterpoint that they're going to talk about test tube babies this week.
Hello, I'm Weekend Update station manager Dan Aykroyd. A couple of months ago, Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby, was born. That is the topic of tonight's point counterpoint. Jane Curtin will take the pro-test tube baby point, and I will take the anti-test tube baby counterpoint. Jane?
Dan, there is no joy greater than that of motherhood. No doubt you cannot understand this because your mother obviously regretted your birth and refused to suckle you, thereby accounting for your fearful, frustrated personality. It is inconceivable that anyone other than a cold, pompous ass such as yourself would deny a woman the chance of bringing a baby into the world just because she's unable to conceive otherwise. What is this, irrational fear of medical advances? Why not deny the nearsighted their eyeglasses? Why not deny the diabetic his insulin? Well, Dan, I just hope that you contract some disease for which they have no cure and that you waste away and die.
Jane, you ignorant slut. The issue here is not motherhood, apple pie, nor is it the traditional medical treatment of disease. The issue here is genetic engineering. Once science can make babies in a test tube, then what? Will science make intelligent babies, pro-socialist babies, slave babies? And who will play God in these decisions? The government, that's who, which is run by liberals like you, Jane. Then the world will be inhabited by billions of laboratory-perfected ignorant sluts like yourself.
That's the news. Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
This was, I thought, excellent between Jane and Dan.
This is my how great is Jane moment. When she starts and just starts ripping into Dan about his mother regretting his birth.
Yes. Yes.
And then I hope you contract some disease that's incurable. The two of them are so good. This is such a great bit. This is probably the smartest thing they do this season is one, get Dan off the desk, but two, bring him back to keep doing point counterpoint because he and Jane are so good at this.
Yeah. And that was it for Weekend Update. They say goodnight.
Yeah, short.
Again. They've also been keeping it short this season. This is the
they
third
have.
one. Yeah.
It's a good call.
Very short.
Yeah. It is short. I guess when Bill only gets one joke, there's not a lot there. It's going to be short, just a short update.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Because you had Celebrity Corner, you had Father Guido Sarducci, and you had Point Counterpoint. Like you still had.
Right. But then you only
just
had,
didn't have the
4 jokes.
Yeah. You didn't have the jokes at the desk. So. Well, then Zappa comes back and performs The Meek Shall Inherit Nothing. I enjoyed that. I mean, again, this is a song that they play that people don't know at this point.
Yeah, another one, yeah.
I'm also impressed at the size of the band. I mean, this one you see the horns in this song, right? So you saw Alan Rubin and Tom Malone playing with them, but
yeah, the SNL horns play, that's right.
Yeah, but they're a pretty tight band.
His voice just like leaves a lot for me to be desired. Like maybe it's just I'm not that generation, but it's just he's more ironic in trying to channel a singer or a crooner than actually being one, which maybe is part of the appeal. And it's just a little lost on me, but.
Well, the next sketch is, I guess, probably the most well-known sketch from this episode.
I think this is the one that everyone like really refers to when they talk about him ruining the show is this sketch. Yeah. I mean, this is like the centerpiece of the episode.
So it starts backstage at a Zappa show and Frank meets Jerry Aldini and Don Kirshner.
This feels to me like they just retread the idea from episode 1. We talked about that Rolling Stone sketch they wanted to do backstage. Jerry Aldini was in it. Don Kirshner was in it. They're like, we have this idea.
Right.
Okay, Zappa's back. Let's just kind of repurpose all of that. Because all it does is set up the Freak Mountain bit.
Yeah, it's needless, right? I mean, maybe Zappa liked Paul Schaefer's Don Kirshner, but you can't really justify it too much. I will say, though, I'll take this moment to encourage your listeners to check out my interview from Vulture with Paul Schaefer, in which he talks about the origin of his Don Kirshner impression. So just as a self-promotional footnote for you guys.
Yeah.
It is a funny story. Then Paul tells it well.
And then he ends up, going off the road when he's driving and ends up at this, I want to call it a castle, I guess, because there's like a knight's armor in the background and stuff. And he comes across Dan and Lorraine's Jason and Chloe characters.
Sunset, yeah.
Yeah. They're back. And the whole bit then just becomes them trying to push drugs on Zappa, who doesn't do drugs and keeps saying, I don't do drugs throughout the sketch. It really started with Jerry Aldini.
No, it actually started with Garrett, because Garrett is the first one he sees, and he offers him a toot and he says no, and then Jerry Aldini, and So your point is right. This whole sketch is them offering Zappa drugs. They can't believe Zappa doesn't do drugs. Him just continually telling people he doesn't do drugs. And at some point, you got to be like, why? Why do you keep hammering it home? Because it's not really funny. And that's, I think, what he saw, because he even said, he was quoted like the year after this, he did an interview and he's like, I'll do this, Night on Freak Mountain stuff, but it's not funny. But that's what you want to do, sure.
Right.
And this is one where he totally is hamming it up again and kind of, doesn't know what to do and is out of his element.
Why was it multi-set? I mean, I will say I liked when SNL used models during this time. I always thought those were kind of funny.
Yeah.
The models is probably the best thing of this sketch.
Yeah.
Is the little model of the car driving in the house. It's probably
the flood.
The best part. Yeah. Yeah. And the flood. Always good.
Andy, what's your take on this sketch?
I mean, I can't defend it, right? I mean, I like seeing Paul Schaefer for selfish reasons, right? I like the sets. Beyond that, I mean, what can you say about going to Xanadu?
Right.
I mean, look, like maybe in 1978, name dropping a bunch of songs by Zappa, maybe that passed as entertainment, I guess. But yeah, I don't have anything too constructive here. I will say, going back to the start of our conversation this episode, this is a notoriously bad sketch, and I think it lives up to that.
This is where I think, again, because we haven't seen Zappa in that much stuff tonight, but you kind of get the vibe that's like nobody wants to be there. Frank obviously doesn't want to be there. John's kind of out in left field. The Jerry Aldini, Don Kirshner characters, like, what are they doing? Especially when they come back. Although I did appreciate when they came back and they were soaking wet from coming in from the rain. I got to give them credit that they actually came in.
It was funny that all three of them were. When he came in, he was wet too.
But I mean, Paul's cue card reading is as bad, if not worse, than Zappa's in this sketch. Like, even when we saw Paul in the beginning, I'm like, what is he doing?
But that's part of his Don Kirshner character, is like he's so stiff and stilted.
I get that, but what I really saw was that he's sitting at the end, and he's at the table talking to everybody at the table, and he's just staring dead ahead, blatantly just reading the cue cards. And he's got that, that Don Kirshner voice, which doesn't help to the fact that it's just, that was more jarring to me, I thought, than Zappa's cue card reading.
This felt long, and it was long. This was just like,
it was.
I was very surprised at this one.
There's been a lot of conversations about, again, like no one from the cast really, jiving with Frank, and none of them wanting to be around. And there's been theories put out that like they just kept this sketch in and writing it to like just kind of attack Zappa. Like, we're just going to keep doing it over and over, because that's all it is a joke again and again about how you don't do drugs. You do drugs. Here's drugs. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's surprising that this sketch can be so long and have no point and go nowhere.
Yeah, like they made the investment in it, right? Like they have multi sets and like it I mean, maybe I'm coming along to you guys a little bit, but it's like it reminds me of the previous sketch about the the at-home prisoner program, where it's like clearly there was a concept and there was a discussion here, but like to what end? Like I'm unsure.
I mean, that I buy as a sketch. Like that's obviously thought of. It's written. We may not buy into it, but like you can see that's a crafted sketch. It's there. There's a storyline. Like there's things happening. This is just. I mean, Gary, I can't believe you haven't called me on it yet. We saw Jason and Sunset come out.
Yeah.
And my first thought was, and I do think if this would have happened, my opinion of this sketch would be a complete 180. They could have dropped the cow. As soon as I saw them, I was like, great. This is a crappy episode. They have a built-in out. They're going to drop the cow. And they never did. Where was the cow?
I don't know. That's funny. I forgot about the cow.
Well, the last time we saw them was that episode. It was the end of season 2 with
Right.
Elliot Gould, and they ran the restaurant that they had, and then they dropped the cow. So I was like, yes. Do you not agree? Would a drop the cow not made this I'm not going to say great, but would dropping the cow not make this a good sketch? I almost said great, and I knew you'd call me on it.
Let's not even say good. Let's just say better. It would have made it a little better. Yes. It would have given you a better out.
At least it would have been like a random left turn or something, which I think is called for here. I mean, I did like that they set the first part of the sketch at like Winterland. Like that's a significant music venue, right? So I appreciated that small detail. I'm just trying to be optimistic here, guys. I'm in a charitable mood at the moment.
Oh, that's adorable, Andy.
No, I hear you. You're fishing for like, what do you do? And yeah, I mean, you get Don Kirshner, which people like. You get Bill Murray doing a good character in Aldini. You get Garrett. Well, Garrett's actually pretty good tonight.
He had like a line.
Hey, it's Garrett.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about Garrett given his contributions here.
All right. Well, fine. Move on from this train wreck.
Wait, just real quick. They made a Boz Scaggs reference.
I did laugh at the Boz Scaggs reference. I actually wrote that down as a personal laugh. I did think that was funny.
If nothing else, this sketch made me put on Susie cream cheese.
Oh,
I'm not sure that I'd heard before.
That's funny. I did the same thing. I wrote it down as things to listen to.
I assumed that was a Frank Zappa reference that I did not get, and I was right.
Yeah, that's it's like his old 60s material, I think, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was off his first record.
Yeah.
But to our point of this being a bad sketch, that's probably the biggest reaction this sketch got when she mentions that people used to call me Susie Cream Juice. It's not a joke. It's Zappa fans clapping and appreciating a Zappa reference.
Paul did get applause for being Don Kirshner. Like people did react to seeing Don Kirshner, which was surprising to me, but delightful nonetheless.
Good for Paul.
Yeah. Well, everyone was in that sketch except for Jane and Gilda, who are in the next sketch, which is the show Woman to Woman, hosted by Connie Carson, played by Gilda. She is a single woman with how does she introduce herself?
A woman with a career talking to women about career, something like that. I can't believe you didn't write that down.
Something like that. Yeah, I know. Well, I was a little.
You've checked out.
Of the podcast or the show?
Which, both.
Yeah, okay.
Column A, little column B.
She's interviewing Mrs. Henry Post, played by Jane, who she initially calls Henry. And she's like, oh, no, that's my husband's name. I did enjoy that joke. Jane plays a mere housewife. She calls her. Yeah. And they're each, bestowing the virtues of their lives to the other. And to the point where Jane is telling her how great married life is, and Gilda gets a little defensive at first and then is just kind of taken aback.
You know, everyone, tomorrow, October 22nd, is Mother-in-Law Day. I myself, a single woman with a career, don't have to worry about that. What are you doing about Mother-in-Law Day?
You know, my mother-in-law and I get along so well.
She calls me with recipes. I call her with remedies for certain illnesses. There's a wealth of information being exchanged between two women who love each other.
Laundry. What about his dirty, filthy socks?
Oh, sorting socks is a form of meditation for me.
Mrs. Post, have you ever gotten up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and the toilet seat is up?
Having grown up in a family with 6 brothers, I always check before I sit.
I mean, this was a unique sketch in the sense that Jane Curtin is playing a very Jane Curtin character, but also not, I thought, because in the sense that you could almost imagine the roles reversed a little bit, where Gilda is the stay-at-home mom and Jane is the straight-laced businesswoman, very serious or whatever. But I think what makes it really work is, Jane is just so good at her Jane thing that she's able to carry over the conventional and traditional aspects of the character.
One of my notes was, I don't think anybody bothered to tell Jane that this was a shit episode. Because every time she delivers, everything she's in today, she delivers. And Andy, exactly. Yeah.
1,000%.
Yeah, this might be one of my more favorite, we can get to that later, but one of my more favorite moments of the episode is seeing the two of them play off each other.
I thought they were both very good, right?
Yeah.
To your point, Andy, you could see them reversing roles, and that with these two, they're both strong enough that they could do that. But I thought they were very good. And just the way that Gilda's tension builds with everything that Jane says, and she tries to throw something else at her and Jane counters. And it's like that back and forth between the two of them is excellent.
Gilda is always, neurotic and playful, that you could easily see her as the mom, but here that insecurity informs the character, and you can see her body language kind of stiffen up a little bit. Yeah.
It's fun to watch. It's a really nice bit to feature Gilda and Jane in, really kind of rooted in reality. It was written by Rosie Schuster and Ann Beats. And I was wondering
if it was those two.
I think those two wrote it. And what's interesting, there's a story in the Hill Weingrad book during this, this era. Gilda actually used to go to Jane's house. Like, Jane was married and had a home life. And they tell stories about how Gilda would go to Jane's house and just watch her be married. Like, not to do anything. She just was there to see what that was like. And Jane, everyone's response was like, it's Gilda and we love her and she's so lovable. But I just wonder how much, if any of that actually did play in to then the creation of the sketch between the two of them.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's an interesting anecdote they tell in that book.
Well, we get two of our writers next. We get the Franken and Davis show.
Yeah, from two of the classic girls of the show to our two bad boys, Franken and Davis.
Oh, God. Okay. The bad boys of the early era.
Tom Davis calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government back when that was implausible and funny.
So they are talking about their wanting to overthrow the government, and then they show us a series of political ads where they each play a candidate and they just go back and forth with the ads, and the political ads essentially up the ante and respond to one another until Tom Davis's candidate is drunk in his ad.
Kind of a quaint concept about mudslinging in political campaigns.
Yeah.
Sadly, these days it would be very tame, I think.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have the hotel pictures of the one guy in sexual relations with my sister-in-law. That was the funniest part for me.
Yeah.
Not Al Franken's dialogue.
No,
but the pictures of Tom Davis. Why is that woman wearing a wig? There's a picture of him and the woman, and they're in bed together. She's wearing a wig. Then the next picture, he's at the end of the bed trying to reach for the camera, but in his other hand, he's holding her wig over his private area.
Yeah.
That's funny.
What's going on? Are you worried that perhaps he'll be running around nude in the House of Representatives?
I felt like this was a well thought out piece. The writing was good. And I think they did a pretty good job with, the ads themselves.
This is one of those, we've talked to you before, but the trunk sketches.
Right.
They've had this. This was one of their pieces. And you've noticed too, Franken and Davis, they're always kind of like an in case of emergency pull here thing. They're always late in the episode, and they're always they've got these in their back pockets. This one, super easy to do. I think Tom is on the same set from the cold open. You just got to sit Tom down, sit Al down in front. They both do straight to cameras, and so I would put money on that this was not in dress rehearsal. Maybe Or maybe it was, but because this feels like things are bad. What do we do? Pull out a Franken and Davis and throw it on at the end of the episode.
Yeah, or it could have just been, you guys write something this week because we're not going to put the host in too many things, and this will be just the two of you.
And again, I think this is just so well done and written for them. Like they've had this part of their routine.
That's fair.
I did like the folder gag. They kept pulling up folders, and it was like tax returns, results, evidence, solid evidence. It's just like so stupid.
After that, we get our third musical number from Frank Zappa and his band.
My answer is going to be no before you even ask. My answer is no, but go ahead.
Brad, do you want to borrow $5,000? Oh, so too bad.
Oh.
So they play. Oh, I know what you're going to say no about. That's good. They play Rollo, and then we see Samurai Futaba come out, and he has a guitar that he fake plays and sings into a microphone that was mounted to the guitar. And then the band does answer how he sings, which was pretty good.
Yeah, the call and response.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, did we need 3 Frank Zappa numbers? And did we need to see the Samurai show up with him again like he did last time? I would argue no on both.
But this has been the staple for when you have musical guests host so far. You've had at least 3 musical numbers from them.
Yeah.
That's how you justify it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jazz rock orchestra, no less, in this one.
Right.
He didn't do anything with his musical numbers to like elevate the show at all. Last time he played, I thought his 2 numbers were fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And now he plays 3, and I thought the first one was good, and the other 2, it's kind of
Yeah.
And I don't think John added much to this.
Right.
He did not.
It's not exactly, Roy Orbison and John or something,
And for us watching, I also thought this was a tough one for TV, because aside from John doing his thing, there wasn't anything to focus on. It was a lot of wide shots because Frank's not doing anything. Frank's back is towards the audience because he's conducting.
He's directing traffic.
Yeah.
So you're either on a shot of Frank doing nothing but conducting with the baton, or you're like on various wide shots of musicians you don't know.
Right.
Of course, as soon as I wrote that note, then I saw Blue Lou. But
Yeah.
It seems a little indulgent, but I mean, then again, it's like if you have Frank Zappa, you need that kind of like left field performance, right? So
Right.
I understand the instinct, particularly where they're like, well, we'll pad it with Belushi. Belushi will make it relatable and digestible for people.
they did this once before. I think it was more enjoyable the first time. But it did seem that John was one of the 2 from accounts I've been able to find. John and Lorraine were kind of 2 of the cast members who either put up with or enjoyed Frank the most. So I could see John doing this with him because, again, as we've talked about before, like John thinks he's above the show at this point, and I feel like he could kind of have a kinship with Frank coming in thinking he's above the show. I'm like, I'm with you, we're both better than this, blah, blah, blah.
But also, one thing to think about with Belushi is that he sees himself as a recovering hippie, right? Like he's at the 1968 Democratic Convention. When you see pictures of him, when he describes himself coming of age in the 60s, he's very much of that culture. So I think it's very natural for him to be, on paper, to be partnered with Zappa, who's also kind of this, vestige of 60s music.
Yeah. Just why? That was all that I kept thinking when he was on.
Let's just get to
Futaba.
Mr. Bill, the most accessible thing of this episode.
We see Mr. Bill moving into his new penthouse apartment.
Mr. Bill moves in.
Yeah. Mr. Bill moves in, and then Sluggo comes to help him decorate. He needs a dogskin rug. They paint everything. He uses his leg as a leg for the table.
Can I take his leg off to help the table? Yeah.
Yeah. Second week in a row we've seen Mr. Bill.
Yes.
Yeah. I liked how they kind of, I don't know if this was purposeful or not, but they kind of continued the story from last week where the last thing we saw was him fall flat on the top of a taxi cab and drive away. And the first shot of this episode was a taxi cab pulling into the shot. So I thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I mean, for an episode that's known for being a bit of a train wreck, all I can think of, you get a perfectly solid Mr. Bill, you get the second appearance of Father Guido Sarducci, and you get a noteworthy Coneheads. I mean, I think that's worth, and technically, we just talked about you get the samurai, right? So you kind of get bang for your buck.
I guess I don't know. Like I who love John didn't necessarily think samurai worked. I don't love this Mr. Bill. It feels, my note I wrote down, Garrett, is like it feels very season 4. There's nothing new to it. They're just playing the beats in a new locale with nicer sets. Like he has a nicer set, but I think that this was them giving the audience what they want.
Right. Yeah.
It kind of was a very middle of the road.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think middle of the road is better than Trainwreck. That's my point.
True. Well, this is going to go back to our argument. I don't think this episode's a train wreck. I think it's just a very bad episode. Mr. Bill, I'm curious though. It actually got a good reaction when the cab pulled up and it opens the door. It says the Mr. Bill Show.
Yeah, crazy reaction.
It's like, does the audience know? Like, does the general audience know at this point that Mr. Bill is a thing? We're going to see it more because now we've seen it 2 out of the first 3 weeks. We've seen it back to back. I wonder what was known.
It feels like it's catching on at this point.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it's catching on at this point.
Yeah.
Right?
Walter, let us know.
Yeah.
Walter Williams, yeah.
Walter, send us an email. Walter, send us an email at notreadyforptpod@gmail.com.
Well, like, because Franken and Davis, in the opening credits, they say, yo, Franken and Davis or Father Guido Sarducci. They mention them in the opening credits. If Mr. Bill is like an integral part of the show, like, would you not announce that as part of your opening credits? And, an episode of the Mr. Bill Show or something like that.
Right.
So I'm trying to figure out where it falls just kind of in the world of how it was presented to people.
No. I mean, you could credit it like you do the Franken and Davis show.
Right.
In the opening credits. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting.
Can we just note briefly the title card at the end of the episode? I think it's the day the Earth slowed down considerably. I thought that was fun.
That's actually what I was going to say. Yeah. We don't usually talk about them, Gary, but I thought that was a good one.
Yeah.
And that's it. Then we go to goodnights. And Frank is on stage to say goodnight. And then Dan and Lorraine come on as Jason and Chloe still.
Inexplicably. Yeah.
Inexplicably.
Friends of Chevy Chase. Worth pointing that out, I think.
Yeah. Friends of Chevy Chase Inc.
Yeah.
Everybody likes to point out that the cast all kind of stands away from Frank and no one really wants to talk to him, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, whatever.
Yeah. People are reading into that a little.
You see that before.
And that's it. That's our show.
We're done. That's our show.
So I think we all agree it's not a train wreck, right?
No, I mean, you see headlines like the unfunny night Frank Zappa got himself banned from SNL, which I think I've said to you guys before. I don't believe in banning. You just don't come back.
Right. Right.
Here's something else, by the way. Do you think he wanted to come back?
Right.
Why would he? Yeah.
He has been open on how he did not like the show, especially back then. He wasn't into the drug culture. He didn't like the show. They obviously threw that back into his face. So here's like the SNL revisionist history. What if Frank's like, I'm never coming back?
Right.
And the show's like, no, he was banned.
Yeah. It's such clickbait. Like, here's our list of the, Andrew Dice Clay. Like, I just don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Anyone who doesn't come back is banned, right? Because they don't come back.
It's not a good episode, but you can't blame Zappa. He's only in 2 sketches.
Here's Nathan Rabin. Frank Zappa's excruciatingly awkward SNL episode is nothing short of a catastrophe or zaptastrophe. I feel like that's just a little, with all due respect to our coined Manic Pixie author, I just think that's overkill. Like I don't find this episode excruciatingly awkward. I find it middle of the road and a bit mediocre, but
even if you did, that lies the blame that Zappa ruined this episode. And that's what I'm trying. I keep harping on. It's not Zappa's fault. And everything you read about is Zappa and Trainwreck, and he was so bad. The dude did a monologue, which was decent. That went into his own musical numbers. He's only in 2 sketches.
Right.
It's like you
and
can't.
The Conehead ones, I will defend. Right. So what are we?
Wasn't as bad.
I feel like it's not even the worst Conehead sketch.
So we're talking about the Freak Mountain one, really, which, granted, that is a bad sketch and does deserve, some criticism, right? But like that doesn't ruin the episode for me.
Agreed.
Mr. Bill, like woman to woman, like that's good. Like there's enough here to justify the episode.
Yeah.
Oh, see, I don't know. You think so?
I mean, I think there are some things. I think Woman to Woman is a good sketch. I think
It's not bad.
the Weekend Update as a whole was good between the Celebrity Corner and Father Guido Sarducci and then Point Counterpoint. Franken and Davis show wasn't, it was decent. It wasn't horrible. It was,
It was long.
Yes.
But because it was so long, you got enough. I feel like I said this on another one of theirs. You get enough funny one-liners. It's so long that they throw enough at you that every once in a while you get a funny zinger.
So I feel like, there are definitely, we've seen other shows with fewer good sketches, in my opinion, than this one. And I don't think Frank Zappa, I agree with you. I don't think Frank Zappa is to blame at all.
It's overstated.
I think you go into it overhyped and then it underdelivers because you're thinking train wreck and it's going to be a disaster and like one of the worst, most monumental failures ever. And I feel like we've said this before, kind of a little bit like on Louis' Last a little bit, but it's just It's just a bad episode. It's just a really bad episode where the host did himself no favors. I think it's a bad episode. They do the dress rehearsal. He realizes it and he just doesn't know what to do.
Well, because he's not an actor.
He started really taking offense to some of the comedy.
Yeah.
And he thought he could do things better. And so he just kind of, I think the biggest storyline of like the whole train wreck thing is Frank Zappa blatantly and purposefully kind of turning on the show and not telling anybody, like, I'm going to read these cue cards and be stiff and ham it up and do all this stuff without, because he didn't tell anybody that until they're on air. And so now you've got your cast members like trying to react and continue the world of the sketches, or there's 2 sketches, I should say, dealing with that.
I think it worked fine in Conehead.
There are moments it looks like Dan is really trying just to push through that Conehead sketch when you can see Zappa's kind of going out on his own and Aykroyd's just like, get through.
Right.
So to me, we're really just talking about one clunker of a sketch. I think Coneheads are their own thing. I think it works having Zappa in that universe. So to me, it's like we're really just talking about like one misguided. I mean, maybe you could throw in the prison one too.
Yeah, I would say those 2.
Yeah, there's a couple bad sketches here. One that has the host. That's where I'm at.
I think you've got really bad sketches with nothing on the equal opposite end of that good.
I guess.
Woman to Woman was an okay sketch.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a great. It's not meant to be a great sketch. It's an okay sketch, and that's what it is. I don't think the samurai showing up in the musical act was very good. I don't think the Mr. Bill sketch was that great. And the Franken and Davis was one of the ones I enjoyed more of them, but it was just kind of long and didn't do much. So,
yeah, I don't care for them usually, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was trying to look back and I have to check, Gary. This could crack my top 10 worst that we've seen so far. This
Really?
Era. I gotta look. I mean, it's not 1 or 2.
Interesting.
But it could sneak in. You know what it was? You'd get episodes that would have something like, oh, there was a really great this, or we got introduced to something here. This just had nothing. It had nothing other than your best sketch being like a C+B rooted in reality with the ladies thing. That's what I don't think helps.
Right. I was even thinking of just, the Rolling Stones episode, but the Tomorrow Show pushes that one ahead of this one. And the nerd sketch.
Speaking of the Tomorrow Show, where was that sketch? That would have been perfect. Tom Snyder and Frank Zappa?
Yeah, maybe because they just did it.
Yeah.
They literally just did it.
Right.
But
Or even him on a talk show with Jane. Like she can carry those along with people too. So
I feel like the 2 of them would have been good too. Like with her not being in the drug atmosphere of the show.
Yeah.
That would have been an interesting pairing. That's true.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get either of those, so
no.
I'll turn to you first, Andy. What were your best bits?
Best bits, Woman to Woman, Mr. Bill, and Coneheads. I will go to bat for Coneheads.
Wow.
Brad is
At a
aghast.
loss for words.
Brad, what are your best bits?
I genuinely struggled, and I've come up with a little bit of an answer outside of the box. My best bits, Jane Curtin. Just watch the times Jane Curtin shows up on set. I thought her Primat was great.
Yep.
She's great in Update. I really liked her little piece with John. I was just surprising. Like, I think she's really good in that. And her performance on Woman on Woman. I think Jane is just good in everything she is in this episode.
Great update. Point counterpoint. Yep.
I agree with that.
Yeah, point counterpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, point counterpoint was my best bit.
Yeah, that's actually a good
I thought
call.
they were both solid. They were both so good. And I think Woman to Woman was really good too. So I agree with Andy on that one. Andy, thank you so much for doing this again.
Thank you.
Great to have you
Sorry,
back.
it was not as a monumental train wreck as we all wanted it to be, and we basically just duped you into coming to talk about a shitty episode.
Well, I like coming on to talk about the one quirky, potentially disastrous episode per season, with more to come. I think now that we're leaving a classic stretch.
Well, we wanted to ask you if you'd like to join us and just co-host all of season 5 with us.
Yeah, right. Or 6.
Since you're here.
No, thank you guys so much for having me. This is so fun.
Andy, tell our listeners where they can find you.
You can find me on Elon Musk's X platform, SNL and Review, or also the Entertainment Weekly recaps.
Nice.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us, Andy. This was great.
Yeah, man. Thanks. It's always a blast to have you in. Thanks so much.
Of course. No, love you guys.
Next week, we're doing something a little different for the project.
Yeah, a little something for the holidays. Should be fun. Hopefully you guys will like it.
You will.
You will.
Until then, good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
Have a pleasant tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please take a moment to rate and review the project wherever you find us. You can also drop us a line to let us know what you liked or didn't and what else you might like to hear in the future at nr4ptproject@gmail.com. And lastly, you can find us on social media everywhere at nr4ptproject. Thanks again for listening. Have a pleasant tomorrow.